Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and thanks for tuning in, and my apologies for the late start. Apparently some technical difficulties out at First Amendment Radio. We can deal with that. We've been dealing with that for years, which brings me to the current topic of discussion. I wish to continue our reading and discussion of this little book, and we will as soon as we get done here, but little business. As many of you know, my regular listeners know that I took the message of Inquisition Update to amateur radio some 20 years ago. The very same things that you're hearing here on First Amendment Radio on Inquisition Update, I was speaking about on amateur radio. It's shortwave radio for citizens. Okay? It has the same coverage, the same propagation characteristics, the same audience as shortwave, except it's non-commercial. It's for the citizen. And my signal was heard from border to border and coast to coast. All 48 states of the United States heard my signals. And I engaged in these discussions for some 7 to 10 years, nightly. Sometimes 16 hours a night. Believe it or not, can you imagine me doing Inquisition Update for more than 1 hour? More than 8 hours? More than 12 to 16 hours every night? That's why my voice is in the condition that it's in. And it turns out that the ARRL, the Amateur Radio Relay League, they are the secular institution, the club, if you will, that maintains jurisdiction over amateur radio and watches over the operations on amateur radio, and then recommends to the FCC disciplinary action for those who violate the rules. They're kind of the amateur radio watchdog. If someone begins to break the amateur radio rules and regulations, they monitor, they record, and they make reports to the Federal Communications Commission, suggesting ways and means of dealing with those violations. Some might even amount to monetary forfeiture, equipment seizure, and fines. And if the amateur radio operator doesn't cease and desist and comply with amateur radio rules and regulations, it can lead to prosecution. Well, the powers that be at the Amateur Radio Relay League didn't like my religious and political speech. And it was causing much contention among the amateur radio community. Now, they all admit I wasn't in violation of any rules and regulations. Amateur radio is governed by free speech, First Amendment, the same liberties that we enjoy here at First Amendment Radio. But they didn't like what I was saying. It was causing people to get out of amateur radio. It was causing people to criticize me and desiring to censor me in some way or another. And censorship is not possible on amateur radio unless people just jam the signal so nobody can hear it. And so the ARRL, whose responsibility it is to report to the Federal Communications Commission jammers, those who use their amateur radio equipment not to communicate but to destroy communication, it was the ARRL itself that recruited its members to jam my signals. Because the FCC didn't have a factual violation. They couldn't take away my license. They couldn't charge me with a violation. I was in perfect compliance with the rules. But even the FCC didn't want my message on amateur radio. So the ARRL took it upon itself, and its members took it upon themselves to jam my transmissions so that I could not engage any longer in these discussions. And the Federal Communications Commission whose direct responsibility is to find those jammers and to punish them, either with warnings, threats of equipment confiscation, license revocation, monetary fines, and everything else. Now, I repeat, they had no grounds to take action against me. I was in perfect compliance with the rules and regulations. I was exercising my free speech of religious and political discussion on amateur radio. The ARRL says no political or religious discussions on amateur radio, but they don't have any enforcement authority. They can't enforce that rule and regulation that they self-made, and they couldn't entice or even goad the FCC into taking action against me because I was perfectly within the rules. So the ARRL, who doesn't like the disruptive political and religious discussions, used their members to jam me off the air, and the FCC took no action against them. They literally forced me off the air. It was virtually impossible. I was running full legal limit power on my signal, 1,500 watts. And I was heard from coast to coast to border until the jamming started. And it started, and it continued unabated for years, nightly. And they even got so sophisticated in their jamming that if I moved from one frequency to another to avoid the jammers so that I could be heard, they had scouts who would dial up and down the band until they found me and then alert everyone else, and they would follow me up to the other frequency and start jamming me there. And so night after night after night, I bounced from one frequency back to another and trying to communicate my movements with my listeners so that they could follow me. And I was incessantly jammed and interfered with for years, with no action taken either by the FCC or the ARRL to stop the jamming. So if you're doing the math with me, it was government-sponsored censorship. Government-sponsored censorship. And since the ARRL was not bound by the Constitution, being a secular club, since they were not bound by the Constitution, they didn't care about my First Amendment rights. They didn't have to uphold my First Amendment rights. And if I was exercising First Amendment rights that they didn't like, then they just jam me. And telling the FCC, well, if you won't find Tom Fress in violation of FCC rules and regulations, then you can't find us in violation of rules and regulations for jamming him. And so the jamming continued and continued and continued for years and years and years until everyone knew it was okay to jam Tom Fress and his political and religious speech. And first thing you know, there was from border to border and from coast to coast jammers dedicated to getting on the radio every night to make sure that no one could hear me. It was continental-wide jamming. There were jamming stations in California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. Everywhere, up and down the eastern seaboard, up and down the west coast, along the northern regions, along the southern border, every state had jammers dedicated to being on the air with me every night and follow me wherever I went to jam my transmissions. And the ARRL and the FCC were helpless to do anything about it, so they say. And I keep getting correspondence either from the FCC or the ARRL, quote unquote, transmissions like yours would best be had on the internet. Take it to the internet. So here I am, First Amendment Radio. Of course, I did both for years too. I was on Inquisition Update, and I did my nightly discussions on amateur radio. I did it both. That's why my voice is completely wore out. Here I am, First Amendment Radio. And I get alone, and I suspected that they've been interrupting my transmissions here on First Amendment Radio for years. I get an email from a listener this morning that says, you're being censored. You've been censored for a long time here at First Amendment Radio. At strategic times, certain words and phrases is cut out. Just simply cut out. Specific words and phrases, sometimes even for 7-second durations, the audio is missing. At strategic times, he said, I finally figured out some of the things you've been saying, and he gave some quotes of things that I did say but didn't come out over the air. I've suspected it for a long time. Censorship right here on the internet, right here on First Amendment Radio. What I want to know is this the only person that has heard these censorship, these brief interruptions in the audio at First Amendment Radio? Are there more of you out there that recognize that at certain strategic times the audio is lost? That all of a sudden your computer or your internet connection goes blank for just a second? The Inquisition Update has been plagued from the get-go with technical difficulties, every kind of unexplainable problems. And this morning even being one of them, a delayed start. What happens when a program is delayed in its start? Well, people think, well, Tom must be having a gallbladder attack. He's not come to the microphone this morning, or he overslept or something. And so they dial up and down the band looking for something else. So I miss my listeners. But that's not all. The censorship continues on and on and on for years and years and years. Is this the only listener that I have that notices these things? I want to know if there's any listeners out there who have the technical ability to discover where this censorship is coming from. A lot of you computer geeks and geniuses out there, can you figure out who is censoring? Is it the federal government? Is it the telephone company? The cable company? The ones who have all the DSL lines? Are they pulling switches? Are they put in place to jam and interfere and interrupt Inquisition Update just like they did on amateur radio? If you're out there and you've been listening to Inquisition Update and you've noticed these strategic blanks in the audio and you've been tempted to write in the past, do it today, will you? Tell me your experiences. Do you think there's an organized effort to censor Inquisition Update and to just confuse and confound and to interrupt and frustrate the message of Inquisition Update? If you do, write me today, will you? Tom at seawaves.us. That's Tom at seawaves.us. Look, I complied unwillingly with the FCC and the ARRL, and I took my message to Inquisition Update on the internet, just like they suggested, over and over and over. Are they still censoring me? And should we tolerate it? Federal Communications Commission has jurisdiction over the internet. And the current enforcement, the current COP, Enforcement Bureau specialist at the FCC, has had long years of experience of regulating internet. And she knows all about it. Maybe my listeners ought to write to her. Her name is Laura Smith. Laura Smith. Amateur Radio Enforcement. And ask her the question. Is Inquisition Update being censored by the FCC, just like it was censored on amateur radio. You told Tom to take his message to the internet. Did you follow him there too? I demand my First Amendment rights to speak on religious and political terms candidly and with thought. The message of Inquisition Update is that church and state have been united. The Roman Catholic Church controls the state. That means the Roman Catholic Church controls the FCC. And if the Roman Catholic Church does not like what Tom Fress is saying on Inquisition Update any more than they like what Tom Fress was saying on amateur radio about the Roman Catholic Church and its control of the state, then certainly, if the FCC, the state, tolerated the jamming on amateur radio, certainly they'll tolerate the jamming on Inquisition Update, too. Laura Smith needs to be put on notice. I have a First Amendment right, and I intend to exercise that right and expose their jamming, just like it was exposed from border to border and from coast to coast on amateur radio. It's the government that's responsible for the jamming, both on amateur radio and the internet, because the government has jurisdiction over both. Now, if the Amateur Radio Relay League and the FCC were doing their job, they would search to discover who it is that's jamming these lawful transmissions, both on amateur radio and on Inquisition Update, and they would find those violators and take their license, strip them of their equipment, fine them, and imprison them if necessary. But what if that jamming is coming from the government itself? Now, I've done all I can do to make my system as faultless as possible. I believe Nicholas has been frustrated for years to get a good, sound internet connection and good, sound computers to run his program. First Amendment Radio survives on the charitable giving of its listeners. Those charitable givings disappear when First Amendment Radio is plagued with technical difficulties all the time. Not only is Inquisition Update hurt, First Amendment Radio is hurt. And I want to know who's doing it. I already know who's doing it. And so do you. And I think we ought to sound off about it. Laura Smith, Amateur Radio Enforcement, Federal Communications Commission, Washington, D.C. Write your letter today. Stop the censorship on Inquisition Update. Stop the censorship on amateur radio. Do your job. Uphold our constitutional rights. Religious and political speech are the most important speech that can be uttered in this country today. I intend to exercise my First Amendment right, my constitutional right, my God-given right. The Bible said, hide not your candle under a bushel. I'm to speak out. That's what I intend to do. And if it reveals who is doing all this jamming, the sooner the better. Now, we'll return to the book, The Origin of Futurism and Preterism. This is about the Jesuit-led Counter-Reformation. Okay? This is about confounding and confusing the Word of God to lead God's people into false beliefs. Futurism and Preterism have deceived the entire Christian world. Futurism propounds that Daniel's 70th week is yet future, that Jesus did not fulfill it. Jesus has not come, because it was Daniel who prophesied precisely when Jesus would come and what he would do. Just read Daniel chapter 9, verse 23 through 27, and there you have it. Christ's first mission, to redeem man from his sins. Not to come and make the Jews the ruler of the world. The rulers of Israel at that time, Jesus described as sons of the serpent, seed of the serpent. You are of your father the devil. Isn't that what he said? Well, the religious leaders of Jesus' day thought, well, if this be the Messiah, then he's going to be our best buds. And we're going to be elevated to kings and priests, and we're going to rule the whole world. That isn't what Jesus came to do. He came to set the captives free, both from their sins and from their religious leaders. The seed of the serpent. Now, the Jews were forbidden to search Daniel's prophecies to ascertain the specific timing of the coming of the Messiah. The religious leaders had literally taken over, and they had made the people servants of themselves. They had heaped so many laws and rules and regulations upon God's people that when they brought their sacrifices to the temple to offer sacrifices to the Lord, they were literally confessing sins that were written by the priest, not God. So they were made to worship and obey their priests and rabbis and not God, because the priests and rabbis had replaced God's law with their own. They had become gods unto themselves, and they controlled all the people. They were revered by all the people. The people trembled at the foot of the priests. Jesus wouldn't have it anymore. Jesus came to set the captives free from their sins and from their priests and their rabbis. And that didn't suit the priests and the rabbis, so they killed him. That's what happens when you get a misunderstanding of Bible prophecy. We'll talk about it more after the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause